Silas got expelled for throwing one punch. In fairness, it was a very good punch. The boy on the receiving end was Zachary, whose father sat on the school board, and who had been holding a smaller student against a wall at the time. None of that made it into the paperwork. What made it into the paperwork was that a scholarship student had assaulted a board member's son, and by Friday Silas was out. His father spent 2 weeks calling every school in the city. Every single one found a reason to say no. Zachary's father had been busy, which left exactly one door still open, and it was the last one anybody sane would have tried. St. Jude High School, the most selective institution in Boston, and inside it the pioneer elite class, which nobody outside the building could describe with any confidence. He had missed the entrance exam window, so his only route in was an external recruitment interview. He asked his father what was on it. No past papers, no syllabus, no published question bank, not even a subject list. His father delivered all of this while looking very hard at his plate. This was a school where the city's actual prodigies went. Silas had been a mid-table student at a public high school, and now he was going to sit in a room with them and be measured. He spent that night trying to cram a year of calculus. Derivatives, vectors, trigonometric identities, all of it sliding off his brain like water off glass. At some point, he stopped pretending and fell asleep face down on the book. Somewhere in the middle of that sleep there was a sound. Not a dream exactly. A dry electrical crackle, close and brief, like a switch being thrown in another room. He woke up on time, which was already unusual, and rode his bike to the same food truck he had used every morning for 2 years. 2 bacon bagels and a black coffee. He had the exact change ready before he opened his mouth, because it had cost the same amount every day for 2 years. The owner told him he had it wrong. It was $5 even. Coffee was $1. Everything on the truck was a whole number. Silas asked why. The man said it was because otherwise nobody could work out the change. He looked up at the price board. Every item was $1 or $2. Not a decimal point anywhere on it. He was fairly certain that had not been true 2 days ago. He did not have time to think about it. He was going to be late to the most important interview of his life. The waiting room at St. Jude held about a dozen candidates, and every one of them looked like a professional examinee. Buzz cuts and heavy black frames, high ponytails and dented steel thermoses, nobody talking. The air in the room had the pressure of a place where people are about to be ranked. Silas sat down, decided he was going to be humiliated, and then glanced at the revision guide open on the desk beside him. The title said it was a manual for memorizing the answers to multiplication and division problems. Small numbers, the kind of numbers you learn before you are 9. Silas assumed it was a joke book, something to loosen up with before an exam. That is genuinely what he assumed. On his other side, a girl was gripping her hair with both hands and whispering the opening of a famous sonnet to herself, over and over, and getting stuck 4 words in. The interviews moved fast. Barely 2 hours and the room was nearly empty. The candidates coming out were wrecked. Red-faced, shaking, several of them openly crying, as if they had just been taken apart in front of a panel of strangers. So Silas walked in expecting the worst afternoon of his life. The chief examiner was a man named Mitchell. He took his glasses off, rubbed the bridge of his nose, glanced at where Silas had come from, and visibly stopped caring. Public school, regular class. He did not bother to look up. He told Silas to start and to be quick about it because the staff wanted their lunch. 5 minutes, 20 questions on the board, 80% required to pass. Silas turned to look at the screen, and his entire understanding of the situation came apart. 20 arithmetic problems, addition, subtraction, small numbers, the sort of thing you are given at 7 years old on a worksheet with a picture of a cartoon frog in the corner. He asked whether that was really the paper. Mitchell told him yes, in a tone that made clear he found the question insolent. Silas decided that if this was a prank show, he was at least going to win it, and started answering. He did not calculate. There was nothing to calculate. It was recall the way your own phone number is recall, 1 question every 2 seconds. Inside a minute, all 20 were filled in. The teachers who had been packing up their briefcases stopped mid-motion and stared. The maths teacher checking the answers began to shake. All 20 were correct. Mitchell had lifted halfway out of his chair. He sat back down very hard, and when he spoke again, the boredom was completely gone from his voice. The board refreshed into a general knowledge round. The next line of a famous soliloquy, the word for something that reads the same backwards. the full name of the first president of the United States. Silas answered all of them without pausing, and spelled everything correctly, which turned out to be the part that unsettled the room most. The examiners had gone completely silent. One of them was staring at the junior teacher who had set the paper with open suspicion, clearly wondering whether he had leaked it. 30 years of teaching, one of them said, and he would not have dared claim a perfect score. Mitchell stood up, pushed his chair aside, walked to the board himself, and wrote out a problem he had found the previous night in a university textbook. The other teachers objected immediately. Far outside the syllabus, they said, much too difficult for a high school candidate. Silas looked at what had been written and had to work not to laugh. It was a basic equation, the kind you are taught in a single lesson and then use for the rest of your life. He did not use scratch paper. He paused for less than a second and wrote the answer. The room went completely silent. Mitchell had stopped moving. His breathing had gone heavy and audible. He asked, and his voice was not steady, for the working. Silas turned back and wrote out 2 lines of the most ordinary algebra imaginable. Mitchell stared at those 2 lines as though they had been handed down from somewhere. Then he pulled out Silas's file, took out his stamp, and brought it down hard. "Congratulations," he said. "Welcome to the pioneer class." Silas rode home with the letter in his bag, and this time he actually looked at the city he was riding through. Every shop sign was in plain block capitals. No lowercase anywhere. Not as a design choice, as though the distinction had simply stopped being used. Every car on the road was a yellow cab. Not most of them. All of them in both directions as far as he could see. And outside a hot dog cart, he watched a golden retriever stand patiently in the queue with a folded bill in its mouth, waiting its turn. Silas stood on the pedal and stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. This was not a prank. Nobody was filming. The world had changed while he was asleep. He spent the whole afternoon at his computer working out what had happened, and by evening he had it. Human intelligence in this world had been cut down by roughly a factor of 1,000. Not damaged, not diseased, reduced cleanly across the entire species. Most people's reasoning ran shallower than you would expect from a clever animal. History still moved, but it was dragged forward by a vanishingly small number of outliers the world called geniuses. By the current count, among 8 billion people, there were none. The last individual anyone agreed to call a genius had lived 1,300 years ago, which meant that an ordinary high school student with an ordinary working brain was, as of this morning, the sharpest mind on the planet. Across the city, Mitchell was sitting in his office staring at a photograph from his own graduation. He had been called a prodigy once. He had walked into the restricted library at Harvard expecting to read the great works, and found he could not follow the first page of any of them. It broke something in him. He came home and taught high school for 30 years, and today a public school kid had solved a university problem in front of him without sitting down. He had called Silas's old principal to ask about him, and got nothing. No record, no prizes, no history of brilliance at all. He was so unsettled he put his lighter in his mouth instead of the cigarette. That evening his father came home and banged on the door, having taken his keys to the site and left them there. Silas opened it and put the admission letter directly against his face. His father read it twice, then called his foreman to cancel his resignation and ask for extra work. They were still celebrating when the television cut to a news report. A series of murders in Chicago. 5 young women, method unknown. The public advised to take care. Silas heard it and something snagged. In a world where nobody could hold 2 thoughts together, how exactly was somebody committing 5 murders without being caught? Neither of them thought about it for long. It was just something on the news. The next morning he reported to Mitchell's office, and Mitchell locked the door behind him. There was one more test before enrollment. Mitchell produced it from a drawer with the care of a man handling evidence. Silas glanced at the first page. It was middle school work, not difficult middle school work either. He finished it in under 10 minutes and handed it back, and Mitchell's hands shook so badly turning the pages that he had to brace them on the desk. Then he took Silas up to the top floor, and the difference was audible before they arrived. The whole building rang with the noise of students reciting things aloud. Every floor except the last one, which was completely silent. Mitchell opened the door on the pioneer class and revealed 20-odd of Boston's finest young minds, face down on their desks, asleep. He hammered on the blackboard until enough of them surfaced to be introduced to the new arrival. Silas was put in the back row, which suited him perfectly. The boy in front of him turned around immediately, blond, loud, and apparently incapable of sitting still. His name was Chris. He wanted to know which prodigy Silas was, and was deeply impressed that he had skipped the on-the-spot assessment everybody else had suffered through. Then he started pointing people out, with the pride of a man showing off a private collection. The boy in the heavy glasses could add and subtract in his head with numbers up to 1,000. That was his gift. That was what he was known for. The girl 2 rows over had memorized several hundred sonnets. Not analyzed them. Memorized them, and the school considered this the outer limit of literary ability. And by the window sat Chloe, who was, Chris said with real reverence, the undisputed authority on general knowledge in the entire year. Silas kept his face straight. A slightly sharper version of the same problem is still the same problem. The class ran on a philosophy of total freedom. Nobody directed what anybody studied. It was left entirely to the student's own discipline, which explained the sleeping. The motivational quotes framed along the wall were where it stopped being funny. One was attributed to Edison, with dates beside his name that gave him a lifespan of several tens of thousands of years. Silas went to the shelf at the back and pulled down a history book, and found the problem was not a typo. It was a survey of Western civilization covering 5 million years. Ancient Egypt was founded somewhere around 1.9 million years before the Common Era. The sequence of history was intact, every event in the right order. It had simply taken 1,000 times longer to happen. Millions of years of people grinding forward at a crawl to produce the amount of civilization his own world had managed in a few thousand. At break, the room emptied out. Silas was about to stand when something skidded off the desk by the window and rolled across the floor. A Rubik's Cube, old, scuffed, and in genuinely terrible shape. One face done, and even the layer under it was out of alignment. He had done a lot of speed cubing at 13. His hands started before he made any real decision about it. Chloe came back through the door at exactly the wrong moment and dropped her water bottle on the floor. She stared at the half-solved cube like she was watching something impossible happen in front of her. Silas apologized for picking it up and asked if she wanted it back. She asked unsteadily whether he could actually finish it. 30 seconds later, he set a solved cube down on the desk. Chloe did not look at the cube. She crossed the room, took hold of his wrist, and stood there breathing like she had run up the stairs. Silas, who had been braced for a scolding about touching her things, had no framework for this at all. She let go as if he had shocked her, went red to the ears, and asked his name in 3 broken attempts. He told her. She repeated it under her breath once and looked at him with an expression he could not read at all. Then Chris kicked the classroom door open with news, and the room forgot about all of it. Patrick had been poached. The class's general knowledge specialist, the one they had been counting on, had transferred to Oak Ridge High School. The state academic decathlon was the following week. Placing well-meant guaranteed university admissions, and Oak Ridge wanted them badly. Specifically, Oak Ridge wanted them for Zachary, the board director's son, the one Silas had knocked down a fortnight earlier. Silas said, from the back row and mostly to himself, that pulling Patrick across this close to the competition meant they only wanted him as a ringer to carry the rest of the team. It was an obvious inference. It required holding one motive and one timing together for about 2 seconds. The entire class went quiet and stayed quiet. In this world, that sentence was a piece of strategic analysis bordering on the visionary. Within the hour, Mitchell called him into the office. With Patrick gone, there was an empty seat on the decathlon team, and Mitchell wanted Silas in it. He was very clear that Silas would not be answering anything. He was to sit there, watch, absorb the atmosphere, and learn. Silas agreed pleasantly, while privately noting that if anybody let him near a buzzer, he was going to take Zachary's team apart. Then Mitchell asked where he wanted to go to university. Silas said Columbia because it was close to home and he had never seriously imagined further. Mitchell refused, flatly and with a heat that surprised both of them. He said talent like this was not going to be buried a second time. Place in the decathlon, he said, and he would put Silas in front of a top mentor at Harvard personally and see the admission guaranteed. Back in class, Chris wanted the details and was baffled by them. Mitchell never fielded anybody he was not certain about. He cared far too much about how things looked. Then Chris looked past him and stopped mid-sentence, because Chloe had given up her window seat and moved to the desk beside Silas. Asked why, she said the window seat was too cold. It was 85 degrees outside. Chris turned that over for a while and could not get anywhere with it. After school, Silas cycled home, and a few turns in he noticed he was being followed. Chloe on a rented bike, keeping a very deliberate distance behind him. He slowed until she drew level and asked whether she lived out this way, and whether she wanted to come over. She turned her bike around and fled. Silas watched her go, shrugged, and rode home down the alley. A few minutes later, on a street she did not know, a white sedan slowed to match her pace. Window came down. The man behind the wheel had a weathered, kind, entirely ordinary face, and he asked if she wanted a ride. Something in Chloe knew immediately. She stood on the pedals and went as hard as she could, which was never going to be enough. The door opened. A hand caught her hair and took her off the bike and onto the road. A cloth soaked in something sharp went over her nose and mouth, and she stopped struggling by degrees, and then entirely. That evening Silas was at home reading historical records, and finding the world more absurd the deeper he went. On a whim he posted on a forum asking what geniuses ate to sharpen their thinking, and got mocked for the presumption of asking. One reply told him that if he thought so highly of himself, he should go and ask the core. He searched the term, and what came back was the strangest thing he had found all week. 10,000 years ago, with civilization stalled, 28 geniuses were born across every field at once, and together they built the only true artificial intelligence this world has ever had. They called it the core. It holds the whole record of human knowledge, sealed behind defenses nobody has broken, and only a genuine genius is permitted to reach it. Silas filed that away as interesting, shut the machine down, and went to bed. It was the last uncomplicated night he was going to get. The phone woke him early, ringing hard enough to drag him upright before he understood what he was hearing. Boston Police Department. His classmate Chloe had been connected to the Chicago murders, and they wanted him to come in. 12 hours earlier, she had been too embarrassed to ride down the same street as him. Now she was the 6th name on a list nobody in this world was equipped to shorten. The police station was busier than he expected, and calmer than it should have been. They handed him a case briefing while he waited, presumably because nobody had thought hard about whether a 17-year-old should be reading it. The man they were hunting was a carpenter named Thomas. 40-something, quiet, well-liked on his street, no record of any kind. 2 months earlier, he had killed his own wife and daughter, and then used their bodies to finish a piece of furniture he had been building. Since then, he had been taking high school girls. Every time he took one, he sent the police a message giving them 3 days. 5 of them so far. Chloe was the 6th. Chloe's grandmother was in the waiting area, so distressed she could barely stay upright. She got hold of Silas's sleeve and would not let go. She had decided he was a detective, and she begged him to bring her granddaughter home. He did not correct her. He was still working out how to explain that he was a student who had known Chloe for 4 days. In his old world, this case would have been finished in a fortnight. Vehicle records, phone data, a behavioral profile, and a man like Thomas is in custody. Here, the entire department was working from a field manual written by a genius 14,000 years ago, and treating it the way other people treat scripture. If a situation was not in the book had nothing to say, and neither did they. Against a man who planned, who chose his ground, who understood that he was being looked for, they were never going to close the distance. Chloe had 2 days left, and she was going to die. So Silas stood up and walked into the command room without being invited. The detective running the case was a woman named Sarah, and she looked like she had not slept properly since the second victim. Silas told her he was from the St. Jude Pioneer class, that his field was criminal investigation, and that he wanted the full case file. The field was a lie. The Pioneer class part was not, and in this city those 2 words functioned as a security clearance. Sarah did not ask a single follow-up question. She handed him a stack of restricted documents and, after a beat, a wastebasket. The photographs were as bad as she expected them to be. Silas got through them, kept his breakfast, and started pulling out what mattered. His first question was how they knew all 6 were the same man, rather than someone copying him. Sarah answered by playing him a video, and it was the most disturbing thing in the file. A white sedan pulls up at the mouth of an alley. A middle-aged man gets out, walks to the camera, and holds up a sheet of paper written in blood. The message said he intended to make an offering to the ones he served. Then he got back in the car and drove into the alley. And that was the problem. Both ends of that alley were covered. The car went in and it never came out. The department had been on this for a day and a half. Their working theory was that the vehicle had vanished, and they meant that seriously. Silas asked whether the alley had blind spots, and whether any large truck had passed through that could have carried a car out inside it. Sarah stopped moving and looked at him the way you look at something you cannot categorize. Then she pulled out the manual and started turning pages fast, because his suggestion was not in it, and she did not know what to do with an idea that came from outside the book. Silas stopped waiting for permission. He walked into the task force room, put both hands on the table, and started giving instructions. Pull every camera on that alley for the whole day. Run it at 60 times speed. Watch what leaves. An hour in, a red sedan came out of the alley. Silas called for it to stop and asked where the car had come from. An officer told him, without much interest, that it belonged to a resident and had nothing to do with the case. Silas laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound, and then he took them through it a piece at a time. Look at the edges of the windows. Look at the tires. There is red overspray on both, sprayed in a hurry and not cleaned off. Same make, same model, same year. The man had found a blind spot, repainted the car where nobody could see him, switched the plates, and driven out through a checkpoint they were all watching. Nobody in the room said anything for a while. In their world, this was not detective work. This was something closer to prophecy. Sarah recovered first. She told the room in about 4 words that everyone was now working to Silas. The red car came back inside 10 minutes. Its registered owner was out of state on business, and the vehicle was supposed to be locked in his garage. Silas sat down in somebody else's chair and started working the problem properly. Trace the red car out through the city cameras. He will have gone somewhere with no neighbors and no foot traffic, abandoned lots, old industrial land, anything derelict. 2 drones with infrared. A tactical team. They're 2 best marksmen, and they move at nightfall because a thermal camera is worth nothing in daylight. Sarah signed off on every piece of it without argument, which tells you something about how badly this case had been going. Somewhere on the far side of the city, in a room Chloe could not see out of, the second day was ending. Thomas had spent it working. He was a genuinely skilled carpenter, and he had been building something to a very specific set of measurements. Chloe had been tied to a chair for 2 days with nothing to drink, and had stopped trying to work the ropes some hours earlier. The thing he was making was a chair. He had adjusted the dimensions specially, and he was pleased with how it had come out. Out at the industrial site, the sun went down and the drones went up. Silas sat in the back of a tactical vehicle watching the thermal feed, surrounded by armed adults who were all waiting for him to tell them what to do. The site was enormous, most of it cold, and for a long time there was nothing at all. Then a weak yellow light came on behind a broken window, 5 floors up in a building that was supposed to have been empty for a decade. Silas picked up the radio and put the teams into position. 2 marksmen took a high position on the opposite roofline. The assault team moved up through the ground floor. Silas went with the spotters because he wanted eyes on the window himself. Through the binoculars he could see most of the room, and what he could see was a man talking cheerfully to a girl who could not answer him. Thomas was showing Chloe the chair. He explained the joinery. He was proud of it and he wanted her to appreciate the work. Then he said it was time to make a small cut on her arm, because he needed to test something before he started properly. Silas told the marksmen to fire. They could not. Thomas was standing directly between the window and the chair. A round that went through him would go through Chloe as well. And breaching was worse. The stairwell was 5 floors of noise. He would hear them coming with time to spare, and he had a knife already in his hand. So the problem was not how to shoot him. The problem was how to move him 3 meters to the left without letting him know he was being moved. And Silas had read the whole case file that afternoon, including the parts nobody had thought were useful. There was an audio file in evidence, a recording left on a phone belonging to the wife and daughter he had killed. Silas pushed it to the team's group channel and told them to play it on their phone speakers, all of them at once, at maximum volume within 10 seconds. In the middle of a silent industrial estate at night, a woman and a small girl started singing Happy Birthday. Inside the room, the knife stopped moving. The recording ran on. A child counted down and wished her father a happy birthday and told him she had bought his present with her own saved money. The present had been a carving knife. Whatever had been holding Thomas together came apart. He went down onto his knees and started crawling toward the window, saying he had not done it, that the ones he served had wanted them, which put him at the glass upright and about 4 meters clear of the chair. Silas gave the order, and a single round crossed the yard and went through him, and the case that had taken 5 girls ended in about 1/5 of a second. The team went up. Chloe was alive, dehydrated, and unable to focus on anything until she saw a face she recognized, and then she came apart completely. While all of that was happening, on the other side of Boston, the state academic decathlon was starting without them. St. Jude sent one competitor. Chris walked into the holding area alone, in a school jacket built for a team of 3. Oak Ridge sent 3. Zachary at the front, and behind him Patrick, who had been theirs for less than a week. Zachary wanted to know where the rest of the team was. Then he asked about Chloe and said he had heard she was going to be cut into pieces. Chris did not answer. He wound up from the shoulder and put him on the floor. Zachary went down hard, bleeding, and started shouting about who his father was, which was the only move he had ever needed. Chris put a foot on his chest, took out his phone, and held a video down where he could see it. He listed it out in a flat voice. The $150 million in contributions Zachary's father had taken. The substitute teacher Zachary had put in hospital at 13. The 2 classmates he had driven to suicide at 15. He said he could put the whole family in federal prison whenever he decided to. The board seat that had protected Zachary his entire life came off him in about 11 seconds, in a corridor, in front of an audience. Chris told him to keep his mouth shut, said something unkind about knowing your place, and walked out to the stage. What followed was less impressive. Chris was 1 competitor against 3, and the format punished that hard. Oak Ridge had divided the work. Patrick carried the heavy questions, and the other 2 handled everything else, which meant they were never all busy at once. Chris had to read, calculate, verify, and answer alone, and the time he clawed out early bled away steadily. Somewhere in the second half, he stopped double-checking a calculation to save 30 seconds, got it wrong, and gave away a point. Silas heard about it on the radio in the back of a police car, on the way home from the factory. He had been awake for most of 2 days. He had watched a man get shot through a window 4 hours earlier, and he sat up like he had been stuck with a pin. He leaned forward and asked the officer, very politely, to take a different route. Back at the arena, Chris was staring at question 28, and he already knew how this ended. It was another chained mental arithmetic problem, the 4th in a row, and the clock was almost out. He decided to guess, picked the 4th option for no reason at all, and put his finger out toward the button. A hand closed around his wrist from the side, and a second hand came past his shoulder and hit the 2nd option instead. The system chimed, correct. Chris turned round and found Silas standing behind him, out of breath, still in the clothes he had been wearing on a rooftop. He asked about Chloe. Silas told him it was done and she was safe, drank half a bottle of water, and asked what the score was. 3 points down with 8 minutes left. Chris said it was finished. Silas said he would take it from here. In the Oak Ridge booth, Patrick heard the chime and looked up. Zachary saw the face on the big screen and came apart. A week ago, that boy had been the bottom of the year group at a public school. Zachary said he must have bought his way into the pioneer class. Patrick told him nobody buys their way into that class, and then went back to the questions, because he did not believe there was anything left to worry about. 3 points, 8 minutes, and 1 substitute who had never answered a question in this competition. The arithmetic said it was over. The next question was a right-angled triangle, 2 sides given. Find the square of the 3rd. The organizers had helpfully printed the relevant theorem underneath the diagram, in case anyone needed it. Silas looked at it for slightly under 5 seconds and pressed the 3rd option. The arena made a sound like the air going out of it. The commentator abandoned the 200 words he had prepared and told the audience that the substitute appeared to be an extraordinarily lucky guesser. Chris, who was 2 feet away, also thought he was guessing and asked what he was doing. Silas leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes, and told him to wake him up when the next one came in. Question 30. A man buys a thing for 8, sells it for 9, buys it back for 10, sells it again for 11. What did he make? Silas answered before his eyes were fully open. Correct, 3 high-difficulty logic problems in a row. Answered instantly, and the room stopped being merely surprised and started being frightened. In the other booth, Patrick had gone the color of paper. He said it out loud that this rate of correct guessing was not compatible with probability. Then he made his mistake. He decided to prove it by solving the buying and selling problem himself. It took him a while. He got it wrong. Oak Ridge's clock reset and their score stopped at 27. Question 31 was a fill-in-the-blank. 1 snail moves at 1 meter an hour, another at half that with a 3-hour head start. When does the first catch up? Silas typed the answer and sat back. That one killed the guessing theory permanently because there had been nothing to guess between. Zachary started hammering the desk and shouting that it was cheating, which was the only explanation available to him. Patrick did something more dangerous. He walked out of the booth, went backstage, and formally lodged a complaint. The competition was suspended. The arena filled up with theories, most of them settling on the idea that Silas had somehow memorized the entire question bank in advance. Chris asked what he was going to do about being accused. Silas did not open his eyes. He said they were welcome to investigate. A few minutes later, Patrick came into the St. Jude booth himself and made an offer. He wanted to choose the remaining questions personally, out of the bank, with no restrictions. In exchange, he produced a flash drive and said it held a decade of financial records belonging to Zachary's father. Silas caught it and turned it over in his hand. He did not particularly care whether it was real. Ruining Zachary was going to take one phone call regardless. What he did want was to see what this world's foremost general knowledge specialist thought a hard question looked like. He took the deal. The host announced that in the interests of fairness, the rest of the questions would be selected by the Oak Ridge team. Patrick's first pick was a system of 3 equations dressed up in unfamiliar symbols with no stated relationships between them. Chris took one look and said it could not be done inside 10 minutes. Silas read it, typed 3 numbers, and sat back. The second was livestock in a pen. 35 heads, 94 feet, how many of each? The audience gasped, because in this world that problem was taught in university number theory courses and took a professor half an hour to lecture through. Silas did it in his head in about 2 seconds and did not reach for paper. The scores leveled at 27 each, and Patrick stopped trying to find difficulty and started trying to find breadth. Obscure passages from literature, cell biology, the founding dates of European dynasties. He went across every field he could reach, hunting for a gap. Nothing Silas answered took him longer than 3 seconds. By question 39, St. Jude had not dropped a single point since he sat down. 33-27, with 3 full minutes still on the clock. Patrick sat down backstage with his hands shaking and understood, finally, that he had not been competing with a schoolboy at any point that evening. He had one thing left. He went into the deepest part of the bank and pulled out a question that had been sitting there unanswered for centuries. It came up on the big screen as a long paragraph, and the people in the audience who followed these things lost their minds. Chris said it was a famous paradox that nobody had ever solved. In the seats above, several university professors agreed it could not be done in 3 minutes. Silas read it and had to work quite hard not to laugh. The question on the screen was the old one about the boy and the shoes. He borrows 50 from each parent, spends most of it, keeps a little back, returns a little, and by the end of the arithmetic there is $1 unaccounted for. In this world it had been sitting in the archive for centuries, with a note attached calling it unsolved. The professors in the balcony had already agreed it could not be done inside 3 minutes, and several of them said so on camera. It is not a hard problem. It is not even really a problem. It is a sentence built to trick you into adding 2 things that do not belong in the same column. The money still owed and the money still in the boy's pocket cannot be added together because the pocket money is already inside the debt. There is no missing dollar. There was never a dollar to miss. Silas could not be bothered to write an essay about it. He typed 1 line into the answer box. The question contains a logical fallacy. Asking where the missing dollar went is mathematically meaningless. It does not exist. The director backstage read it, understood none of it, and marked it correct mostly so the evening could end. St. Jude took the championship. The noise in that arena went on for a long time. On the way to the podium, Patrick walked past him fast, said the password out loud without stopping, and did not lift his head. Then a man in a very expensive suit stepped into his path with a smile that had clearly been practiced in front of something. He introduced himself as Julian from Wellington Private Academy and said he would very much like to get to know Silas. Chris got between them before Silas could answer, greeted him with exaggerated warmth, and called him Little Julian. Then he explained that Silas had a terminal illness which caused severe head pain whenever he spoke, and towed him away by the sleeve. Silas asked what that was about. Chris did not joke about it. He said to stay well away from that man and left it there. On the podium, the host put a microphone in his face and asked how he had done it. Silas could hardly say that he had arrived from somewhere with a functioning education system, so he cleared his throat and improvised. Read more books, read the papers, eat fewer burgers, get more sleep. In the front rows, a large number of Ivy League pre-med students took out notebooks and wrote all 4 of those down. On the way out, a girl named Lauren caught up with him, went pink, thanked him for something he had not registered doing, and asked if she could buy him dinner. Silas, who had been awake for the better part of 3 days, said yes immediately and went home and slept like the dead. While he slept an ocean away, Oxford University was losing its composure. A senior mathematician had watched the broadcast and read one sentence, that the question contained a logical fallacy, and something in him came open. He filled a blackboard, then another. Proofs came out of him for 6 straight hours, all of them descending from one line typed by a 17-year-old to end a school competition. By morning, there were people in several governments reading summaries of it and asking who exactly had written the original answer. At noon the next day, Detective Sarah called him back to the station and handed him a thick envelope of reward money. Then she put something else in front of him. Thomas had kept a diary, and it explained everything, and none of it was what anybody expected. Thomas had not started as a killer. He had been approached about a year earlier by a man who told him he was an envoy for higher powers. The envoy recommended a few stocks. They went up sharply. That was the whole of the proof, and for Thomas it was more than enough. He believed absolutely that he had been chosen. When the envoy told him a sacrifice would be required, he did not ask a single question. He killed his wife and his daughter, and built the throne he had been told to build, and when it was finished, he went back to the envoy to report that it was done. The man laughed at him, took out a phone, filmed his face, and told him what he actually was. Thomas wrote it all down afterwards, and he still did not stop believing. He went to his death certain the powers he served had simply chosen not to save him. Silas closed the book and gave Sarah a starting point. Whoever ran the con had taken money from him. Follow the bank records and pull the cameras along the routes. On his way out, he took the flash drive from his pocket and dropped it on her desk without slowing down. It was exactly what Patrick had claimed. A decade of laundering run through the Oak Ridge School Board director. Once it was verified, Zachary's family were finished. He went to the hospital to see Chloe and stopped at the fruit stand outside the entrance, and this is where the day became genuinely enjoyable. The vendor weighed out a few oranges and asked for 18. Silas took the bag and knew immediately that the weight was wrong. He walked round to the side of the stand and looked underneath, and there was a large black magnet stuck to the underside of the tray. In his old world, he would have argued. Here he had a better idea, because the man in front of him could not hold 2 transactions in his head at the same time. He added 2 grapefruit. The vendor totaled it at 39. Silas paid with 100 and took 61 in change. Then he slapped his forehead, said he had the exact change after all, handed over 40, and asked for the 100 back. The vendor was delighted. He took the 40, returned the 100, and shouted at Silas to come back soon. Silas walked away $21 up with 2 bags of fruit, and then rang the weights and measures office and reported the rigged scale. He was not sentimental about it. A man running a magnet under a scale outside a hospital is stealing from people on their worst day. Then he went inside to see the girl he had spent 2 days getting back, and found that the hospital had a problem of its own. There was a queue outside the cardiac department running the length of the corridor, and people in hospital gowns sitting on the floor because there was nowhere else. A whiteboard by the door said there was an error in the prescription data, and that it was being reorganized. While Silas was reading it, an elderly woman at the front of the queue put a hand to her chest and went down. Her grandson, who could not have been more than 9, threw himself at the department door and started knocking his head against the floor in front of it, begging them to open up. Silas pulled the child up off the floor, took out his student card, and showed it to the security guard. "St. Jude Pioneer class," he said. "Data analysis, let me look." The guard handed over the keys, as though a saint had walked into the building. Inside, 2 attending physicians were in a state close to panic. The patient records had scrambled, names and medications no longer lined up, and they could not prescribe against them without killing somebody. The only person who understood the system had gone to New York on a training course. Silas asked what format the file was in. Both doctors looked at him blankly. He leaned over and looked at the screen. There was a spreadsheet icon in the middle of it, roughly the size of a dinner plate. He opened the file and nearly laughed, because he could see the problem from across the room. Every row was color-coded. Every column had been sorted by color, except the name column, which somebody had sorted alphabetically instead. One wrong click on one menu, and hundreds of people were queuing in a corridor waiting to find out whether they would be treated today. Silas changed the sort on the name column, and the entire document snapped back into alignment. The doctors checked 3 records against the paper files, and then took hold of his hand and tried to give him money and a guaranteed place at medical school. Silas got his hand back and went out past the queue, which had already started moving. The boy who had been on the floor was standing by his grandmother's trolley, watching him leave. Silas rubbed his head on the way past and kept walking, and did not say anything, because there was not much to say. The thing he kept turning over afterwards was that the doctors had not been stupid about the part that mattered. They had refused for 2 days to guess at a prescription. They had held the line and taken the anger rather than risk killing somebody by accident. The intelligence had gone out of this world. A surprising amount of the decency had stayed exactly where it was. Then he went upstairs to Chloe's room. She was sitting up in bed reading a book called 36 Ways to Capture a Man's Heart and muttering the steps to herself. When Silas walked in, she got the book under the blanket at a speed that suggested her reflexes had fully recovered. She eventually admitted she had drawn up a plan: show gratitude first, then dinner, then some kind of shared brush with death, then on a suitably dark and windy night tell him about her tragic past so he would want to protect her. Silas pointed out that they had already done the brush with death and suggested she skip to the tragic past. She did, and the room changed temperature almost immediately. Her parents had not died in a road accident. That was the official version, and she had never believed it. They had been investigative journalists, and they had gone looking at a country in Africa whose average intelligence sat far above every other population on Earth. Not slightly above, enough that the number should have been impossible. They went there and they found out why. And the answer was that decades earlier somebody had manufactured famines and epidemics in that country and used them to kill everybody who tested below a line. The population that survived was smarter because it had been selected. Everyone else had been removed. Only one organization on the planet had the reach to run something like that across an entire country, and the records to know exactly who fell below the line. The story ran, the paper was shut down inside a week. Her parents' car left the road. Every member of the editorial staff died in a fire at the office. Chloe had been small. She had grown up with her grandmother and with a version of events she knew was a lie and no way at all to prove it. She got hold of his wrist again, the way she had in the classroom, and asked him to help her prove it. She said that in a world where nobody could think, he was the only person alive who could go up against the core and get anywhere. And she was right about that, which was the problem. Silas had been in this world for about a week. He had a father who was working double shifts to pay for a school uniform and a friend who had punched a board director's son on his behalf. An organization that had emptied a country to keep a number tidy would not stop at him. He took her hands off his wrist 1 finger at a time and told her no. He said he had people he was not willing to get killed, and then he left before she could say anything else because he did not want to look at her face while she took it. That night he lay awake in the dark and thought about the world he had landed in, and it did not improve on inspection. He had watched a janitor take a beating on a public street for something nobody explained, while people walked around it. He had seen restaurants that turned away anyone in work clothes at the door, as policy printed on a card. There were places you could sell blood in quantities nobody should be selling, tucked behind ordinary storefronts, and there were missing persons reports on the news most evenings. The whole thing sorted itself by measured intelligence and inherited money, and the two together worked exactly like a caste system, with about as much movement between the levels. Zachary and Henry were what that produced. In his old world, they would have been unpleasant, rich boys. Here there was nothing above them at all, and it showed. Before he went under, he looked at the family photograph on the wall, at the plainly dressed woman in the middle of it, and said good night to his mother. The following evening, Lauren took him to dinner, and picked somewhere far more expensive than he was expecting. It was going well. She was easy company. She asked him questions that were not about the competition, and for about 40 minutes Silas had an ordinary evening. Then a voice behind him said something about a boy with no mother, in the particular tone of someone who has practiced being unpleasant in public. Silas was up and swinging before he had finished the sentence, and someone caught his arm before it landed. The man behind the voice was Henry. In Silas's old world, he had been Zachary's hanger-on, and his family had run a struggling games parlor. Here, board games that taxed the mind had been elevated to something close to a national religion, and the family academy had made them aristocracy. Henry traveled with bodyguards. He mentioned that his family held a stake in the restaurant and told Silas that school fights were one thing, but the real world ran on power. Julian appeared from somewhere, pulled up a chair, sat down uninvited, and looked at Henry the way you look at a street performer. He asked whether Henry had missed the news, and mentioned that the boy he was threatening had won the state championship the previous evening. Henry checked his phone, and his expression changed. He was arrogant, but he was not slow, and a pioneer-class champion sat above him in every ranking that mattered. So he changed target. His eyes moved to Lauren, and he gave his men a look and told them to take her outside. Julian spoke again before Silas could move, and what he said was more effective than anything Silas had planned. Henry's brother was one bad result from dropping out of the professional ranks, and Julian was his next opponent. If anyone laid a hand on the girl, Julian would forfeit the match and end the brother's career on the spot. Henry went the color of a bruise, said something about Julian being ruthless, and turned to leave. Silas hit the table hard enough to move the cutlery and told him to stop. He said that if Henry wanted him this badly, he would give him a clean way to get him. A game, Henry's own family discipline. If Henry won, Silas would drop out of school, surrender his guaranteed university place, and hand over the championship title. Henry turned all the way around at that. And if Henry lost, he would apologize to Lauren, and then kneel down and bow to Silas twice in front of the room. Lauren and Julian both started pulling at his clothes and telling him not to be an idiot. They both knew what Silas did not, which was that Henry played at the level of a professional first dan. Henry smiled and took the bet, because he did not believe for a second that a boy who had spent his talent on general knowledge could play a serious strategic game. The bodyguards cleared a table. Somebody produced a board of pale, expensive wood and 2 lacquered bowls. They drew for color. Henry took black, which meant he moved first. He picked up a stone, gave Silas a look that was pure theater, and put it down in the exact center of the board. Silas frowned. Opening in the middle against a champion is not a strategy. It is a message, and the message is that your opponent is not worth playing properly. So he answered the way you answer that. He took a white stone and set it on a star point out on the 4th line, claiming a corner. The room went completely silent. Julian's face did something complicated. Lauren asked him quietly whether Silas had made a mistake. Julian said it was not a question of a mistake. He said he was no longer sure Silas knew how to play at all. Henry laughed so hard he had to sit back in his chair, then leaned in and placed his 2nd stone directly beside his 1st. Silas stared at that. 2 stones side by side in the middle of the board with no shape and no purpose he could identify. He put a 2nd white stone on the opposite star point and took his 2nd corner, which in any sane opening is a rock-solid position. The look Henry gave him back had actual pity in it. He said that begging like this would not help and that he was looking forward to the kneeling. Then he placed a 3rd black stone beside the other 2, and the 3 of them sat in a neat, unbroken row across the middle of the board. Silas looked at that row for a long moment, and something in the back of his head began ringing like a struck bell. He turned round to Julian and asked, in a voice that was not entirely steady, what game they were currently playing. Julian looked at him as though he had asked which way was up, and said that obviously it was 5 in a row. Silas sat back and looked at the board with an expression that was doing a great deal of work. The board was a top grade 1. The bowls were lacquer. The bodyguards had carried it in like a religious object, and the game being played on it was the one Silas used to play on squared paper at the back of maths lessons when he was 11. He asked Henry to confirm it. Henry confirmed it and looked at him like he was slow. He had never heard of the other game. It did not exist here. So the entire aristocracy of this world, the professional ranks, the academies, the national obsession, was built on a game you can teach a child in 90 seconds. He picked up a white stone, and now that he knew what game he was actually playing, the whole thing became a completely different problem. 2 of his stones were sitting uselessly out in the corners, because he had put them there for a game nobody in this world had ever heard of. Henry had 3 in a row in the middle of the board and the initiative entirely, against a competent player that is close to decisive. So Silas stopped trying to build and started doing the only thing available to him, which was blocking. Henry came at him hard. Open threes, split threes, fours that had to be answered immediately. Every single one of them Silas answered. Never early, never with anything clever, just the one stone required to stop it and nothing more. From outside, it looked like a man being slowly suffocated. Lauren could not watch it directly, but Julian's face was doing something else. He had started worried, and somewhere around the 10th exchange he had gone confused instead, because Silas was not only defending. Every block he played was also a stone on the board, and he was choosing which of the available blocking points to use. Henry was choosing where Silas had to answer. Silas was choosing which answer to give, and the two are not the same amount of control. Around the 20th move, Henry's pace changed. He had noticed something and could not yet name it. He had held an enormous advantage for the entire game. All he needed was for Silas to miss once. Silas had not missed once, and there was nothing on the board that looked like a mistake. Eventually, he stopped moving entirely. Silas tapped a point on the board and told him where to play. It was, he said, the only remaining place Henry could still make an open three. Henry checked it was. He asked through his teeth how a boy who had been the worst student in the district a month ago was doing this. Silas yawned. He said that if Henry was frightened he could concede now, though he was welcome to leave the building on his knees instead. Then he stopped blocking and started using the stones he had been quietly accumulating around the outside of the board. Henry's position was already sealed. Every direction he might have grown in had a white stone sitting in it, put there over the previous 40 moves while he thought he was attacking. Lauren felt the room change before she understood why, and started smiling. The last stone went down with a sound like a struck coin. Henry said immediately that it was only an open three and he could block it, and then Julian told him to look at the diagonal. The stone had made two threats at once. The second ran diagonally, and it used a stone that had been sitting out at a corner doing nothing since the first move of the game. Henry started to ask whether Silas had planned that from the opening. Silas said no, honestly. He had put that stone there for a completely different game. He had simply steered things until it became useful because finishing there was more satisfying, which was, if anything, worse. Silas looked up and asked him to settle the bet, and offered to have the room cleared first if he wanted privacy. Henry sat very still for a moment. Then he smiled and asked what bet. He picked up the napkin they had written the terms on, tore it into pieces in front of everybody, and handed the pieces to a bodyguard to burn. Lauren said furiously that half the restaurant had watched them agree it. Henry said she was very welcome to call them over and ask them to testify, and then asked, pleasantly, who exactly would be willing to cross his family. Nobody moved. He walked past Silas on his way out and said quietly that there was no hurry and that they had plenty of time. Julian watched him go and said there was nothing to be done. The Crown Strategy Club that Henry's family ran was too large and too well connected. If he denied it, it had not happened. He added more kindly that Silas had at least made his point, and Henry would not come near him again for a while. He called it the best available outcome. Silas thought about it for a while, and then asked a question that made Julian go quiet. He wanted to know whether there was any mechanism by which a top-tier club could be made to collapse completely. There was. Julian explained it reluctantly. It is called kicking the pavilion, and it is written into the rules of the International Association. A challenger who defeats every top player a club can field has proved the club has no standing, and it loses its right to operate. That is why only one such club is permitted in Boston at a time. Julian then spent some time explaining why nobody does this. A failed challenge means covering the club's operating costs for a decade and a lifetime ban from competitive play. Crown had several 7th Dan players in residence and at least 1/8. Silas said there was no need to be afraid. Lauren asked him seriously whether he was confident. He said he would win. She said that in that case she was coming with him and refused to be talked out of it. The Crown Strategy Club occupied a building that had clearly been designed to intimidate people before they got through the door. Lauren was waiting for him outside, standing a very deliberate distance from the entrance. He asked why she was so far back if she was so confident. She admitted she was a little bit scared. Silas told her not to worry and said that shortly they would be the ones who were frightened. Then he took a can of spray paint out of his bag, walked up to the marble pillar at the entrance and started writing on it. Lauren made a noise she had not planned to make. He was about 2/3 of the way through a fairly rude assessment of the club's abilities when a young man in club uniform came out at speed. He wanted to know what was happening, Silas asked him what it looked like. The young man looked at him, and at Lauren, and at the red paint on the marble, and turned round and shouted into the building that somebody was kicking the pavilion. Inside, the club's resident seventh Dan heard the report, and did not take it seriously at all. His name was Oliver. He asked how long it had been since anyone had bothered, said something dismissive, and sent out a student who was close to turning professional. Inside 5 minutes, the student came back and reported that he had lost. Oliver stood up. He found Silas in the advanced game room, sitting on a leather sofa with his ankle on his knee, turning a folding fan over in one hand. The student who had just lost was sitting opposite him, gray in the face. Oliver introduced himself and his rank, and offered Silas a way out. Apologize, clean the pillar, and the whole thing would be forgotten. Silas declined and then recited the challenge rules back to him. The club could field up to 10 players. One loss and the challenge failed. The game just played counted as the first. Oliver asked whether he understood what failing would cost him. Silas said he did. So Oliver asked why he was here at all. Silas said he had come to collect a debt because the director's son owed him one and had refused to pay. Oliver sent the student away and sat down himself. They drew for color. Oliver took black and opened in the center, exactly as Henry had. This time Silas did not waste a stone on a corner. He answered directly beside it. Julian arrived partway through with Lauren's friend Sophie, took one look at who was sitting opposite Silas, and stopped in the doorway. By 30 stones, the position looked entirely one-sided. Oliver had attacked without pause, and Silas had done nothing but defend. And Oliver had gone very quiet, because he had just noticed that he had exactly one live formation remaining, and every other direction had been closed off. Meanwhile, the white stones were sitting in a shape that carried more threats than he could count, and were doing nothing with any of them. Oliver said he had only ever felt this once before, playing the world number 1 as a young man, and asked Silas to stop holding back and use his full strength. Silas smiled and shook his head, and put a stone down on the far side of the board, well away from anything that mattered. It joined 2 pairs of stones that had been blocked at one end and written off 10 moves earlier. 4 dead stones became 5 live ones, at an angle nobody had been watching. Oliver said, in a voice gone completely dry, that he had set this up 10 moves ago and could have finished at any point since. Then he resigned, and the club sent out the 8th Dan. The 8th Dan lasted about 10 minutes. After that, the club stopped sending its best and started sending everyone it had, in the hope that volume would do what quality had not. Silas beat all of them. He did not appear to find it especially interesting. Between games, the club tried changing the conditions. Longer clocks, then shorter ones. It made no difference either way, which told the players watching more than the results did. Oliver sat through every one of them. By the 6th, he had stopped watching the boards and started watching Silas's hands. By the 5th game, there was a crowd in the doorway. By the 8th, people were filming. The man who owned the club was out of state. He got back that afternoon on a private aircraft. Sterling had built the Crown Club out of nothing, and he understood exactly what a completed challenge would do to him. Before the car had left the runway, he was making calls. One of those calls brought an honorary master out of retirement. The other brought something considerably worse. The voice that came out of the back of the building was old and calm, and it stopped every conversation in the room. Julian's face went the color of the tablecloth. He said the name twice before it meant anything to Silas. Victor, the world number 1, not the best in Boston or in the country. The strongest living player of the game this civilization had organized itself around. He walked up to Silas, looked him over, and asked whether he was the boy who had beaten 5 ranked masters in a row that morning. Silas snapped the fan open and said that was him. Lauren stepped in and objected that Victor was not a member of the club, and the rules only permitted the club's own players. Victor turned to Sterling and offered to join the club for 1 day. Sterling accepted before the sentence was finished. So Silas raised the stakes, on the grounds that if they were bringing in outside help, he was not going to keep playing for a napkin. He wanted half of everything the Sterling family owned. The stock positions, the funds, the property, the club itself, and he wanted Henry to face a consequence. Sterling agreed instantly, without any negotiation at all, because he did not believe there was the slightest chance of losing. One of Sterling's own advisors leaned in and suggested quietly that the terms might want checking. Sterling waved him off without looking. It was the single most expensive gesture anybody made in that building all week. They set the board. Silas drew black, which meant he moved first, and in this game that matters more than anything else on the table. He opened in the center. Victor answered on the diagonal carefully, the way a professional does. And then Silas stopped improvising and started using a documented opening from his own world, one that has been studied to death and is considered a guaranteed win for black. Victor was genuinely strong, far stronger than anything the club had put up. It made very little difference. He was looking at Silas's moves the way a bright student looks at a professor working through a proof. He could follow each step. He had no idea why any of them had been chosen. At the 21st move, Silas made an open 3. Victor blocked, he made a 4. Victor cut it, he made another. Victor blocked again. Every one of those blocks was necessary. Every one of them also put a white stone exactly where Silas needed it not to be a threat later. On the 37th move, he set a stone that made 2 winning threats at once, and there was no answer to either of them. Victor sat at the board without moving for a long time. Afterwards, Victor asked him where he had learned the opening. Silas said a book, which was true, and did not mention that the book had not been written in this world. Victor said he had spent 40 years believing the game had been fully explored, and that he had been wrong for all of them, and thanked him for it. The old master beside him eventually asked how much of his strength he had used. He said all of it, and that he had lost completely and without excuse. The room came apart. A 17-year-old had beaten the strongest player alive, in front of witnesses, in the club that had built its authority on being unbeatable. Lauren and Sophie were hanging off each other in the doorway, making a noise that got them looked at. Sterling stood in the corner looking like a man attending a funeral he was paying for. And then, because he had not built what he had built by grieving, his expression changed completely, and he came across the room smiling and called Silas boss. He said the transfers and the equity handover would be arranged within days, that he would move half of last year's profits across as well, and that the club would keep trading with this year's takings going to Silas. Silas understood the maneuver perfectly. Sterling was not surrendering, he was buying in. A boy who could beat the world #1 was worth considerably more to him as an asset than half his portfolio was as a loss. Silas asked for one thing on top of the assets, and it was not money. He wanted a community college place restored to a student who had lost it to a donation. Sterling looked at him for a moment, plainly recalculating what kind of person he had just gone into business with, and made the call from where he stood, which suited Silas because a powerful family owing him something was more useful than a powerful family destroyed. He took the deal and then asked about Henry. They brought Henry up from somewhere, in the building between 2 of his father's own men. He saw Silas sitting where he had been sitting that morning and stopped being able to control himself. He wanted to know why Silas had won, why he could not simply have stayed at the bottom where he belonged. Then he went for his throat and was put on the carpet. Silas crouched down, looked at his face for a while, told him it was not a good look on him, and stood up and left. Behind him, he heard Sterling instruct someone to put Henry on a plane in the morning and send him to the Alaskan interior. Henry thought he was being sent abroad to sit out the scandal. Silas had looked at a map of that region once and knew precisely what kind of place it was. That evening, Silas was on the sofa at home, doing very little when his phone went. It was Marcus, who had been his closest friend since middle school and who wanted to go out and drink about something. They met at a corner bar and clinked bottles, and Marcus took most of his in one go and said his college place was gone. Silas nearly laughed, because it was a community college and Marcus was describing it like a national catastrophe. Then he looked at his friend's face and stopped, because Marcus was not exaggerating at all. Marcus did not find out for another 2 days, and when he did, he rang Silas at 6 in the morning and could not get a full sentence out. Silas told him it had been a phone call and to stop making it into a thing, and then lay in the dark for a while feeling better about the week than he had about any of the rest of it. His academic score had been more than enough. The place had been reassigned to the son of somebody with money, and there was no process to appeal that. And Silas finally understood the shape of the ladder he had landed on. Because intelligence had been cut so far down, most people were selected out during elementary school. Finishing high school made you highly educated. Reaching any university at all put you in roughly 1 person in 100, which meant a place at a community college was worth pulling strings over. It was worth a rich family spending real money on. It was, in this world, a life. Silas told him he would sort it out, and meant it, and had a reasonably clear idea of who owed him a favor large enough to do it with. 2 days later, the internet stopped talking about Silas and started talking about a machine. Victor had played 3 games against a research laboratory's artificial intelligence and had lost all 3 of them. The reaction was not disappointment. It was closer to bereavement. This was the discipline the entire culture measured human worth by, and a machine had taken it in an afternoon. But at the press conference, Victor said one thing that changed the shape of the week. He said he was not the strongest player he had ever met, and that he intended to ask the person who was to play on humanity's behalf. The entire internet spent 2 days trying to work out who he meant. Silas found out when the old master rang him directly. He said no at first. The machine had no weaknesses worth the name. Its calculation was total, and turning up to lose in public did not appeal to him. The old man said that in the final game, Victor had tried something of Silas's, and the machine had shown a flaw. He said only Silas could win. Silas was still declining when the old man went quiet, and then said something that landed harder than it should have. He said the machine had no soul, and that if it won, everyone who came afterwards would only ever copy it. He asked what the difference was between playing without a soul and being dead. Silas was preparing a polite refusal to that, as well when the old man mentioned the prize money. 200 million euros. Silas asked him to repeat the currency, and then agreed on the spot for the dignity of humanity and the honor of the international game. 2 days later, the entrance to the International Federation building was packed. Silas pushed through it, showed his pass at the door, and watched the security guard read the name and look up very slowly. Outside, camera crews were still arguing on air about who the mystery challenger might turn out to be, while he walked past them in a hoodie and went inside. In the match room, the research team saw him come in and stopped what they were doing. Their director turned to Victor and asked whether this hope of all humanity was seriously a high school student in a hooded sweatshirt. The broadcast went out. The internet lost what remained of its composure. Silas sat down opposite a terminal with a camera above it and a cable running out of the back of the room and drew for color. He took black and he moved first. The first game lasted 27 moves. The machine did not let him build the opening he had used against Victor. It pressed hard and early and closed the shape down before it existed, which would have mattered if that were the only opening Silas knew. He switched to a different one and started cutting the board apart. By the 20th move, he had closed off around 70% of the machine's available lines, and the projected win rate on the display began falling off a cliff. On the 27th, he made 2 threats at once, and the game ended. Victor crushed a water bottle in one hand hard enough to soak the old master sitting beside him, and did not notice he had done it. The research director requested a half-hour recess and said it was for the cooling system. Silas knew exactly what it was for. They were going to spend 30 minutes taking his game apart. He was not concerned, because playing first in this game is close to an unbeatable advantage, and he had it. They drew again for the second game. Silas took white, which was effectively that. White moves second. White has no guaranteed opening, and against a machine that never miscalculates, being permanently 1 move behind is not a disadvantage you recover from. The machine opened in the center and then played back Silas's own structure at him, move for move. It had learned the whole thing from one game. Silas noted that, filed it, and fought for as long as the position allowed, which was several dozen moves and not quite enough. What unsettled him was not losing. It was watching the machine use his own opening better than he had used it, 11 hours after seeing it for the first time. It had not memorized the moves. It had understood why they worked, extracted the principle, and rebuilt it from the ground up in the time it took the engineers to drink a coffee. 1 each. The third game would decide it, and the third game decided rather more than the score. They drew for the last time. Silas got white again. You could feel the room give up. Several of the spectators actually sat back in their seats. Victor did not sit back. He leaned further forward, and the old master beside him noticed and asked what he was watching for. He said that in 3 games, he had never once seen the boy look worried, and that he was not going to start assuming he knew what that meant now. Silas was philosophical about it. He had won a game which was one more than anybody else had managed. He was mostly thinking about the prize money. He placed a stone without much intent. The machine opened in the center and pressed straight into the same structure again. And then his hand stopped halfway to the bowl, because everything the machine did was built on shape. It evaluated stones that participated, stones that attacked, defended, connected, or blocked. So what happened if he played a stone that did none of those things? A completely useless move. A stone that attacked nothing, defended nothing, and connected to nothing. No competent player would ever place one, so there was no reason for the machine to have any handling for it. Every training game it had ever played had been against something that wanted to win. Every move in its entire history had carried intent. A move with no intent at all was not something it had been trained to beat. It was something it had been trained to assume could not happen. And nothing in the rules said he could not. He picked up a white stone and set it diagonally out from the center, forming a strange offset shape with another of his stones that pointed at nothing. Below the stage, Victor frowned so hard it registered on the broadcast. The machine paused, only for a few seconds, but it paused and then went back to attacking. Silas ignored the threat entirely and played another one further out, at the same peculiar spacing. The commentary team decided he had given up. Several outlets said so live. Silas heard one of them say it and did not correct anybody. Because a player everyone has written off is a player nobody is watching properly. It was somewhere around the 48th move that Victor stood up. Because the white stones were not random. The gap between every one of them was locked to exactly the same distance. And at that spacing, any black stones caught inside the pattern can reach 4 in a row and never 5. It was not an attack. It was a grid. A geometric cage laid over the whole board, one useless-looking stone at a time. Silas had learned it as a trick for beating beginners. Here it was the only thing on earth the machine could not parse. Victor said to nobody that it was not a strategy at all. It was architecture. The boy had stopped playing the game and started building the room it was played in. It kept calculating connections and blocks, and every calculation was correct, and none of them were about the thing that was happening. Silas walked it around inside its own territory for a dozen moves. The way you walk a dog through a maze, it built itself. On the 60th move, he connected 2 live 3s, and there was nothing left on the board that could answer either of them. The room went up. The commentary called him the new master of the game, then corrected itself and reached for something considerably larger. A 17-year-old had overturned the accumulated strategic knowledge of a civilization that had been playing this game for 3 million years. Silas collected the trophy, stood for the photographs, and had a check for 200 million euros put into his hands. He was still working out what a person does with that when he walked out of the building. A heavy truck came off the road and across the forecourt at speed. Silas moved on instinct rather than thought, went backwards and sideways, and took the wing of it across his left arm. His head hit the concrete. The old master, standing 3 meters away, did not move in time. Several reporters did not either. Men in dark suits had him off the ground before he had finished falling, and put him into an armored vehicle rather than an ambulance. The truck had not braked. There were no skid marks anywhere on the approach, and it had been aimed with a precision that took the investigators 3 days to stop arguing about. It had come for the one person on that forecourt whose death would matter, and it had very nearly got him. He woke up somewhere underground, in a bed, in a facility that had clearly been built to survive something. A man in a tactical vest was standing at the end of it. He introduced himself as Agent Carter and the organization as the United Nations Genius Council. Silas asked whether all of this was because he had won some board games. Carter said it was not. His answer on the paradox had been reviewed by a university academic committee and verified. As of that week, Silas was the only confirmed genuine genius among 8 billion people, and the council existed for exactly one purpose, which was keeping people like him alive. Then he showed him a document that recorded Silas as deceased. Silas asked why. Carter said it was standing procedure and that every rule in their handbook had been written on the back of somebody dying. Silas did not push it. He asked how many names had been on their list before his. Carter said none. There had not been a confirmed genius to protect in 1,300 years, and the council had spent that entire time waiting. An organization with a budget, a command structure, and international authority, staffed continuously for over a millennium, on the possibility that one person might eventually turn up. There was a briefing going on next door about the truck. Silas got out of bed and walked into it. A room full of senior officers stood up in unison, which he was not remotely prepared for. They had been working the incident for 3 days. The trail led back toward Zachary, which surprised nobody. But 10 minutes after the truck, they had intercepted an encrypted transmission belonging to an organization none of them could identify, which called itself the Domain. Silas asked whether anybody had checked the truck keys for fingerprints. Nobody had. He told them to go to his house, find the business card in his jacket, and compare the prints on it. An hour later it came back confirmed. Julian, the polished young man from the private academy who had stepped in twice to help him. The general ordered an immediate arrest, and the agents reported that Julian was not at his apartment. Silas said that was fine and rang him. Julian answered and spent a while pretending to be surprised, which Silas did not have the patience for. He told him to stop, said there were too many holes in the performance, and pointed out that modern communications can be traced in real time by military satellite. Then he hung up. 3 helicopters were over the building inside a quarter of an hour. Silas stood on the roof in the downwash with his clothes flattened against him, and found that having a national war machine standing behind him was an extremely pleasant sensation. The roof door came open and Julian walked out with his hands up. His suit was soaked in blood that was not his. He had dealt with an accomplice on the way up, in case they talked. Then he sat down on the roof opposite Silas like they were old friends and threw him a drink. Silas did not catch it. Julian told him there was a bug in this world. He watched Silas's face when he said it, and then said that he had been right and that Silas had understood it. It was an encrypted note, he said, left in the margins of a history of technology by the man who built the core. In the eyes of true geniuses, the world looks different. Then he finished his drink, stood up, and walked to the edge of the roof. Silas told him to remember to apologize to the people he had killed. Julian said there was nothing to apologize for, that he had walked the path the domain believed in and leaned backwards off the building. He stood on the roof for a while after that, and then walked back toward the helicopter. Carter's voice came through the earpiece on the way down. As long as Silas stayed alive and visible, the domain would go quiet and stay quiet. They only surfaced when a genius died. That was the entire pattern, going back further than the records went. Silas asked what happened to the other groups that hunted people like him. Carter said there were none, because 5,000 years ago the domain had eliminated every organization that threatened a genius permanently, which made the domain either the greatest protector in human history or the most possessive thing on the planet. And Silas was not sure the distinction mattered much from where he was sitting. Then Carter told him the part he had been building up to. He needed to stop being Silas. The name was on international broadcast. If he kept using it, everyone standing near him became a way of getting to him. Silas thought about his father, and about Marcus, and about a girl in a hospital bed who had already lost both parents to an organization that killed people for asking questions. He agreed. He asked what happened to his father. Carter said the man would be told privately once the funeral had run, and that he had already been moved somewhere with a permanent watch on it. Silas asked whether that was protection or containment. Carter said that in his experience there was rarely a meaningful difference, and that he should get used to it. The following day, at the most expensive funeral home in Boston, they held a service for him. Silas attended it, in sunglasses and a black mask, standing at the back like a man who had wandered into the wrong room. The photograph at the front had been cropped out of his school identity card, which meant the entire hall was mourning a boy in a badly lit passport photo. The attendance was extraordinary. The chairman of the International Federation, the state governor, the director of the research team whose machine he had beaten. The director looked worse than anybody. He said the machine had been retired because its evaluation logic had collapsed and there was no route back for it. Lauren stood at the door in a black dress with her eyes rimmed red, and Sophie stayed beside her the whole time. Marcus sat in a corner, obviously drunk, holding a bunch of white chrysanthemums that he would not put down for anybody. Silas watched them from the back of the room for a while, and then took out a phone on an encrypted number and sent all 3 of them the same message. "Stop crying, I am not dead." Lauren read it, went absolutely still, then pressed her mouth shut, grabbed Sophie by the arm and marched out of the building. Marcus stared at his for a long moment, and then started to grin, and then pulled out a notebook and began writing at speed. 10 minutes later they opened the floor for friends and family to speak, and Marcus went up. He explained that he had known Silas since middle school, that they had been extremely close, and that he wanted everyone to remember the real him. He then shared 3 stories, at length, in front of a state governor and the chairman of an international federation. One involved a dormitory, the middle of the night, no shirt, and a great deal of enthusiastic singing. The other 2 were worse. By the end of it, the identity of Silas was not merely retired. It was unusable. The genuinely strange part was standing at the back of a room full of people who were sad about him, and understanding that most of them had never met him. 3 people in that building actually knew him, and all 3 had received a text message half an hour earlier telling them he was fine. The footage ran on the news channels on a loop for 2 days, until Silas had Carter use the council's authority to pull all of it. 2 months after that, the digital trail had been scrubbed properly, and the public memory of his face had gone soft the way public memory always does. He put on a pair of black-rimmed glasses, took a new name, and became Evan, first year at Harvard. The council gave him documents, a history, a school record, and a family that had never existed, and did it well enough that he could not find the seams himself. The only thing he kept was the folding fan, which was sentimental and which he did not intend to explain to anybody. 3 months later, he boarded a long-distance train up the East Coast toward Cambridge. The economy carriage was full and smelled of it. Cheap perfume, sweat, packed bodies, people going a long way for work. In the corner by the vestibule, a woman was crouched on the floor holding a baby. Silas asked whether she had a seat. She said, quietly and without any expectation of it helping, that she did. Number 27. Number 27 was occupied by a woman in her 50s in an expensive suit, with her son beside her in something equally expensive. Silas told her politely that she was in someone else's seat. She looked at him as though he had spoken to her in a foreign language, and asked whether he was seriously suggesting she should stand up for someone like that. Silas said yes, and told her it was the woman's ticket and to get up. The carriage went completely silent. The son sized him up, decided he was not an ordinary passenger, and tried reason. They were going to a funding meeting in Boston, millions by the minute. Was it not simply appropriate that people at the bottom made room? Nobody in the carriage said anything. Generations of being stepped over will do that. Then the woman spotted the folder in the side pocket of his backpack, and the university crest printed on it. She asked if he was a student there. He said yes. She asked his name, and he gave the new one. She laughed, took out her phone, and rang a dean she clearly had a number for. She said there was a first-year student whose conduct had been reported as questionable, and asked him to find a reason and expel him. Then she put the phone down and told him an expulsion notice would reach him inside 10 minutes, and that this was the price of interfering. A small collective sound went round the carriage. Everyone there had watched this exact thing happen before from this exact seat. Silas looked at her and smiled, and raised one hand to tap twice against the small communicator in his ear. It connected to the highest priority channel the council operated. He said one sentence into it quietly and put his hand back in his pocket. The woman with the baby had got up off the floor and was trying to apologize on his behalf, begging them not to ruin his future. Silas put a hand on her arm and told her it was fine, and that there was nothing to worry about with people like this. A few minutes later, the woman's phone rang. She answered it in front of everyone and put it on speaker so the carriage could hear her victory. What came out of it was the dean shouting. He told her that the person she had chosen to offend was someone the Defense Department would not touch, that her son's $60 million funding round had been frozen and terminated within the hour, that the family could sit and wait for what came next. The son had gone the color of the seat covers. Silas put his hands in his pockets, leaned against the side of the carriage, and gave her a genuinely brilliant smile. The woman with the baby got her seat. Nobody in that carriage forgot it, and several of them were still talking about it a week later. Silas stood in the vestibule for the rest of the journey, watching the coast go past, and thought about how much of that had actually been him. Very little of it in the end. He had not outwitted anybody. He had made one phone call using authority somebody else had handed him. In his own world, that call would not have worked. There were courts and process and people who could tell a dean to go away. Here there was one lever, and it had been handed to him, and he had used it to get a woman a seat on a train. It had felt very good, and he was aware of exactly how thin the line was, which was the thing he kept coming back to. In a world this shallow, being clever had not made him powerful. Being clever had made him valuable, and then powerful people had bought him. And there were still the parts nobody had explained. An organization that had emptied an entire country to keep its numbers tidy, and had killed 2 journalists and a whole newspaper for noticing. A girl who had asked him to help her prove it, and who had been told no by the only person alive capable of doing it. A man in a good suit who had murdered several people, protected Silas twice for reasons he never explained, and gone off a rooftop rather than be questioned. And a note in the margin of an old book, left by the man who built the core, saying there was a bug in this world. Silas had spent a week being told he was the smartest human being alive, and he had worked out what that actually meant somewhere around the second game against the machine. It did not mean he was exceptional. He had been an average student in a world with a functioning education system. He had failed exams. He had been expelled. Everyone else had simply been made worse, and somebody had done it on purpose and had been doing it for a very long time, which is a different problem entirely, and not when you get to walk away from twice. The train came into Cambridge in the late afternoon. A first-year student called Evan got off it with one bag, a folder with a university crest on it, and 200 million euros he had not touched. Nobody on that platform looked at him twice, which was, for the moment, exactly what he wanted and was not going to last. For 11 months after that, nothing happened, and Evan found that he liked it enormously. Nobody at Harvard knew who he had been. His documents said he was an unremarkable first year from an unremarkable school, and the council had built that history well enough that he could not find the seams himself. The teaching was, by the standards he had grown up with, a catastrophe. An entire semester of introductory mathematics covered what he had been taught in about 6 weeks at 14, and the students around him found it genuinely difficult. He had learned to answer about one question in 4, and to get one of those slightly wrong, because a first year who is never wrong stops being a first year very quickly. It was a strange kind of work, spending every day being slightly stupider than he was. It was also the safest he had been since the morning the world changed. The money sat untouched. 200 million euros, half a family's holdings, and a monthly statement he had stopped opening. He had used it exactly twice. Once for his father's mortgage, arranged through a solicitor who believed the money came from a dead relative, and once for a college place. His father had been told the truth eventually, in a room with no windows, by a man in a tactical vest. He had taken it about as well as anybody could, which is to say badly, and then he had started sending letters. They came through the council, redirected twice, and arrived with a fortnight's delay. Evan wrote back every time. He had not seen him in 11 months. He thought about the core roughly once a week, usually late, and each time he put it back down. He had made a decision in a hospital room, and he had stuck to it. He was one person, with a father, a friend, and no army. Some problems are simply too large for the person who notices them. The 3 people who knew he was alive were allowed to write to him, and once a month Lauren came up on the train. She had gone to a state college and was studying something practical and complained about it constantly, and Evan looked forward to those evenings more than he was willing to say. In the 11th month she arrived and did not take her coat off, and he knew before she sat down that something had gone wrong. Chloe had stopped answering her phone 8 days earlier. Evan pointed out that people stop answering phones. Lauren said that Chloe had not missed a Sunday call with her grandmother in 4 years, including the week she had been tied to a chair in an abandoned factory. She had missed 3. Evan asked, already knowing, what she had been working on. Lauren said she had never stopped, not for a single week since the hospital. She had simply stopped mentioning it to him because he had made it clear that he did not want to hear about it. There was a version of that sentence that was an accusation. Lauren did not deliver it that way, which somehow made it land harder. They went to Boston the next morning. Chloe's grandmother let them in and made tea neither of them drank. The old woman did not recognize him, which was the point of the glasses, and she talked about her granddaughter in the present tense for 40 minutes. Then she showed them Chloe's room, and Evan stopped in the doorway. The wall was 4 years of work. Newspaper records, land registry printouts, shipping manifests, photographs of aid convoys, census figures with columns circled. It was not the wall of an obsessive. It was organized. There were 3 columns and a legend, and the legend told you what color of thread meant what. A 17-year-old with no training and half the reasoning capacity of anybody in his old world had built a genuine investigation out of patience, and it was better than most of what he had seen at the police station. Evan stood in front of it for a long time, and the thing he felt was not admiration. It was shame, arriving late and all at once. The last 3 months of the board were about a name rather than a country. Dr. Elias Vance, the man Julian had named on a rooftop before he went over the edge, and the man who had built the core. Evan had never told Chloe that name. He had never told anybody that name. It had been said once on a roof to him by a man who died 4 seconds later, which meant Chloe had reached it independently, from the other direction, working backwards from a country full of dead people. He started reading the board properly, and inside 20 minutes he understood 2 things he did not like at all. The first was that almost everything written about Vance was wrong in the same specific way. Every source agreed he was one of the 28. Every source placed him in a different century, not slightly different. Spans of thousands of years apart, in records that agreed on everything else about him, down to the same anecdotes. In a world whose entire timeline had been stretched by a factor of 1,000. That was either a filing error repeated across every archive on Earth, or it was the only honest thing in the record. The second thing was worse. In the last fortnight of pinned material, Chloe had found where the primary documents were held. Not in a government archive, not in the core. In a restricted collection inside a university library, uncatalogued, unlent, and unreadable. Evan recognized the building immediately, because he walked past it 4 times a week. It was the restricted library at Harvard. The one Mitchell had walked into as a young prodigy 30 years earlier and walked out of with his faith broken. He had told Silas that story himself in an office months ago. He had said he could not follow the first page of any of them. Evan had been living 400 meters from the answer for 11 months, going to lectures, deliberately getting questions wrong. The last item Chloe pinned to that board was a train ticket to Cambridge, dated 9 days earlier. 1 day before she stopped answering her phone. Lauren asked him what he was going to do. She asked it flatly, without pressure, in exactly the way she had told him about the missed Sunday calls. And Evan discovered that the decision he had made in the hospital, which he had defended to himself every week for 11 months, had not actually survived contact with a train ticket. He had told her no because he had people he was not willing to get killed. She had gone anyway alone with a corkboard and a library card, and she had done it because he said no. That is not a moral argument. It is just arithmetic, and Evan had never been able to leave arithmetic alone. On the way out, he stopped in the sitting room and told the old woman that he would find her granddaughter. She thanked him and asked whether he was one of Chloe's teachers. He said something vague and left before it got worse. That evening, he rang the only number he had that connected to anything larger than himself. Carter answered on the second ring, which told him the council had a person assigned to that line permanently. He asked for access to the restricted collection. Carter said it was not theirs to give, that it had never been theirs, and that the council had been trying to get a reader into that room for 600 years. Evan asked why they had never managed it. Carter said because for 600 years nobody they sent had been able to read a word of what was in there, and the collection only admits people who can. He took the first train back to Cambridge, and he did not go to his lecture. The building was old even by the standards of the ones around it. Gray stone rather than brick, narrow arched windows, and a door that had been built when doors were a security measure. There was a brass plate beside it with a collection name on it, and no opening hours. Evan stood at the bottom of the steps for a while, thinking about a man in a tweed jacket who had gone up them 30 years ago and come back down a different person. Then he went up them. The woman behind the desk inside did not look up when he came in. She asked, in the tone of someone who had said it several thousand times, whether he was lost. Evan said he wanted to look at the Vance material. She put her pen down. She asked him how he knew that name, and there was nothing polite left in her voice at all. Evan said a man had told him on a roof, about a year ago, immediately before jumping off it. That was, apparently, an acceptable answer, because she stood up. She told him the collection was open to any reader who could read it, that this had been the rule for 11 centuries, and that in her 31 years in that building nobody had ever managed the first page. She also told him that the last person to try had come in 9 days ago, had also failed, and had left in a considerable hurry. Evan asked to see the name in the ledger. She turned the book round for him without being asked twice. It was Chloe's handwriting, and it was the last entry in the book. The woman said her name was Professor Hale, and asked whether he still wanted to go through. Evan said yes and followed her through. The room was smaller than he expected, and very much older. Perhaps 400 volumes, all bound the same way, all the same height, arranged with no titles on the spines and no catalog numbers. Professor Hale gave him the rules in about 40 seconds. Nothing leaves, nothing gets photographed. He could take notes in pencil and she would read them before he took them out. She said the collection had never once been closed and had never once been used, and that she found those two facts equally depressing. Evan sat down at the nearest desk, turned on the lamp, and pulled a volume off the shelf at random. It opened stiffly. The paper was heavy and had not yellowed. The text was in English, printed rather than handwritten, and the first page was a single paragraph of about 90 words. He read it, and then he sat back, and then he read it again. It was not difficult. That was the shock of it. It was a clearly written definition, stated once precisely with no repetition and no examples. And every subsequent sentence in the book assumed you had that definition held in your head permanently, along with everyone that came after it. There were no worked examples in the entire volume. There were no chapter summaries. There was nothing restated anywhere, because restating something is a courtesy you extend to a reader who might have lost it. That was what had defeated everybody, not the vocabulary, the depth. These books were written for a mind that could carry 9 or 10 dependent ideas at once and never put one down. In this world, most people manage one. The very best of them, the ones the schools called prodigies, manage two. Evan had been reading textbooks like this since he was 15. Badly and with a lot of complaining, but he had been reading them. He got about 40 pages in before he realized Professor Hale had been standing at the end of the aisle for some time, not moving. She asked him what page he was on. He told her. She asked him what the book was about. Evan told her in one sentence, and watched a woman in her 60s put a hand on a bookshelf to keep herself upright. She said she had read the first page of that volume perhaps 600 times over 31 years. She said she had always been able to read the words. She had simply never once got to the end of the paragraph, still holding the beginning of it. Evan stayed in that room for 9 hours, and stopped only because Hale physically turned the lamp off. What was in the collection was not secret knowledge. It was ordinary knowledge, written down properly, by people who had never needed to make anything easier. Physics that went several steps past anything he had been taught. Chemistry, materials, a medical volume he did not have the background to follow, and 3 books that were about the core. Not descriptions of it. Engineering documents. Specifications with tolerances written by people who were building the thing while they wrote. And in the margins of the 3rd volume, in pencil, in a fast, untidy hand that had pressed hard enough to score the paper, somebody had been arguing with the text. The annotations were Vance's. Hale confirmed it without being asked. She had spent a decade cataloging the handwriting and had never been able to read a single note in context. Evan read them for 2 days. The first thing that became clear was that the core had not been built to store knowledge. Storage was a side effect. It had been built to do something to people, deliberately, and the 28 had known exactly what. The second was that it had a register. Every human being alive has an entry in it. Not a name exactly, and not a birth record, but something derived from one, generated at registration and maintained continuously ever since. Whatever the core does to a mind, it does through that entry. Vance's margin notes were very clear about it, mostly because he was furious about it. He had built most of the addressing system himself. He wrote, in a margin, that he had understood what it was for on the day it was finished, and not 1 day earlier. And then, about 2/3 of the way through the volume, next to a paragraph on how the register handles people who fall outside it, he had written the line Julian said on the roof. There is a bug in this world. Evan read the paragraph. It was attached to about 15 times, and then sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. The paragraph was about error handling. It described, in flat engineering language, what the system does when it encounters a person for whom no register entry exists. The answer is nothing. It does nothing at all. It cannot act on what it cannot address, and the designers had not thought this was a problem because there is no mechanism by which a human being can exist without being registered. Unless, of course, they arrive from somewhere else. Evan had spent a year believing he was unaffected because he was special, and had been quietly embarrassed about it the whole time because he knew perfectly well that he was not. He had been an average student. He had failed the same exams 3 times. Nothing about him had ever suggested he should be the sharpest mind on a planet of 8 billion people. And he was not. He had never been throttled because there was nothing in the register with his name on it. He was not a genius. He was an unhandled exception, which is a considerably less flattering thing to be, and a considerably more useful one. He asked Hale whether the collection had a register of its own readers going back to the beginning. She said of course it did. 11 centuries of names in ledgers in a cupboard. Roughly 9,000 people had come in. Every one of them had failed. Evan asked whether anybody had ever succeeded. She said 4 and that she had the dates. The gaps between those 4 dates were enormous and almost exactly equal, something on the order of 1,300 years each, which is roughly how long it had been since the last person anybody in this world agreed to call a genius. 4 people in 11 centuries had walked into that room and read the books. 4 unhandled exceptions, spaced out with the regularity of something on a schedule. Evan asked what happened to them. Hale said that she had wondered that for 31 years, and that the honest answer was that every one of them stopped signing the ledger inside a fortnight and was never recorded anywhere again. Evan pointed out that he had now been signing it for 3 days. Hale did not laugh. She got up and locked the office door, which he had not expected. Then she told him about the girl who had come in 9 days ago. She had arrived with a folder, asked for the Vance material by name and been given it, because those are the rules. She could not read a word of it. Hale had watched her try for 6 hours, which is 5 hours and 40 minutes longer than most people manage. And then, Hale said, she had done something none of the 9,000 had ever done. She had stopped trying to read it and started copying it out by hand instead, word for word, without understanding any of it, at about a page an hour. She had got through 19 pages before the collection closed. Evan sat very still while he worked out what that meant. She could not use the information. She had known that the entire time. She was copying it out for somebody who could, and there was exactly one person in the world she had in mind. Hale said the girl had left at closing with the notebook in her bag, and had signed the ledger on the way out, and had not come back the next morning. Then she said the part she had clearly been deciding whether to say for 3 days. 2 men had come in the following afternoon and asked to see the visitor's ledger. They had not asked for any book. They had photographed the last page and left. Evan asked whether she had reported it. She said to whom, and he did not have an answer for that. He asked her one more question, whether the ledger recorded the names of people who came in and looked at the ledger. Hale said it did not, because that had never been necessary. Then she stopped and said that the desk camera had been running since 1981. It took her 40 minutes to find the tape, because it was an actual tape. The picture was terrible and the 2 men had been careful with their faces, but one of them set a case down on the desk while the other photographed the page. The case had a shipping label on it, and the shipping label had a routing code, and Evan had spent a fortnight of his life reading customs manifests in a police station. It was a bonded freight code. It told him the case had come in through a port, and it told him which one, and it told him it had not been declared as anything that would have been inspected. Evan spent the rest of that night in the collection, and by morning he had read the 3rd volume end to end and filled 40 pages of a notebook. Hale read every page of those notes before she let him carry them out, which was the rule, and which took her 4 hours because she stopped constantly. At the end of it, she said that she had spent 31 years guarding a room she could not enter, and asked him, without any self-pity at all, what it was actually like to be able to think. Evan did not have a kind answer, so he gave her an honest one. He said it was mostly like being the only person awake in a house that is on fire. 2 days later, Carter listened to the whole of it in a room with no windows, without interrupting once, which Evan had not expected. At the end of it, he asked one question. He wanted to know whether Evan was certain about the register, or whether he was reasoning from a margin note written by a man who had been dead for a very long time. Evan said the margin note was the least reliable part of it. The addressing specification was in the printed text, and he had read it 4 times, and it did not leave much room. Carter thought about that, and then said something that reframed the previous year entirely. The council had never been able to explain why geniuses appear at roughly 1,300-year intervals. They had assumed it was something about the Core's cycle, and had spent centuries looking for a mechanism. There is no mechanism. There is no cycle. It is simply how often a person turns up who is not in the register, and there is only one way that has ever happened. Carter did not ask him to finish that sentence, and Evan did not offer to. The 2 of them sat with it for a moment, and then moved on, and neither ever raised it again. What he did offer was the freight code off the case in the library, and that turned out to be worth more than any of it. Bonded freight is cargo that has entered a country but has not formally been imported. It sits in a designated warehouse, untaxed and uninspected, until somebody decides what it is. It is a legal blind spot roughly the size of a shipping terminal, and it exists in every port on Earth for entirely boring reasons. Evan had spent 2 weeks of his life reading manifests in a police station while looking for a man who repainted cars, and he had never expected that to be the most useful fortnight he ever spent. The council pulled the records for that code in about 90 minutes. The consignment had been entered under a shell company, and the shell had been dissolved and reformed 4 times in 11 months, which is a great deal of work to go to for something you intend to leave in a warehouse. The manifest listed the contents as laboratory glassware. The declared weight was wrong for glassware by a factor that Evan worked out in his head and then checked twice because it seemed rude to be that confident. Carter asked how long he needed. Evan said he needed to be inside the building because everything he had was inference, and inference does not open doors. They went in at 2 in the morning, which is when a container port is at its least interested in anybody. The council did not raid it. Carter was very clear about that. A raid produces paperwork, and paperwork produces an hour of warning for anybody with a friend in a customs office. So 4 people went over a fence with a bolt cutter like criminals, which Evan pointed out and Carter did not dispute. The bonded warehouse was mostly empty, which was the first thing that was wrong with it. A bonded store is expensive. You do not lease one and then leave 9/10 of the racking empty for 11 months. The consignment was in the far corner. 11 crates, stenciled with the shell company's mark, and Evan knew before anybody opened one that they were not going to find laboratory glassware. They found server hardware, racks of it packed properly with the shock indicators still unbroken. Evan looked at it for a long time, and then said the thing that made Carter put a hand on his sidearm without appearing to notice he had done it. This was not equipment for running something. There was no networking in the crates, no power distribution, nothing you would need to operate any of it. It was spares. Somebody was holding replacement parts in a place with no customs record for a machine they did not want anybody to know they were maintaining. Carter asked quietly whether he was suggesting the core was a physical object that could break. Evan said he was suggesting it was a physical object that had already broken several times over a period of years, and that somebody had been quietly keeping it running. The books in the collection had described a machine designed to run without intervention for 100,000 years. Vance had written in the margin that the estimate was optimistic by 2 orders of magnitude. He had been right, and somebody had known he was right, and had spent an unknown number of centuries covering it. It was at that point that one of the council team came back from the far end of the building and said there was a room in it. A partition board room built inside the warehouse, with a steel door and a lock on the outside. Everything in that building was 11 months old and covered in dust. The partition board was clean. Chloe was inside it, and she had been there for 11 days. She was not injured. She had been fed. There was a desk and a chair and a lamp and a stack of paper, and that was somehow much worse than any of the alternatives Evan had prepared himself for. She looked up and looked at him for a while, and then said that she had wondered whether the glasses were his idea or somebody else's. They had not hurt her. They had asked her repeatedly and politely to keep copying. She had got 19 pages out of the library. They wanted the rest of the volume, and they could not get it themselves, because the collection admits people who can read it, and they had never once managed to send one. So they had taken the only person on record who had sat in that room for 6 hours and produced anything at all, and asked her to keep going from memory. Evan asked her what she had given them. She said 11 days of very convincing rubbish. She could not read the material. She could, however, remember precisely what real technical writing looked like, having stared at 19 pages of it for 6 hours. So she had been producing pages of confident nonsense in the correct register, at about a page an hour, and handing them over with an apologetic expression. Evan pointed out that this had a shelf life. Chloe said she was aware of the shelf life and had been counting the days, and that they had recently started asking sharper questions. Then she asked whether he had actually read it. He said he had read all 3 volumes. She put her head back against the partition wall and laughed for slightly too long, and then stopped abruptly and did not explain why. Carter got them out through the fence rather than the gate, and had the team leave the crates exactly as they had found them, including the dust. He said that a warehouse full of spares that nobody knows you have found is an asset, and a warehouse full of spares that somebody knows you have found is an empty warehouse by Thursday. They put Chloe in the back of a car with a foil blanket she did not need and drove her out through the terminal gate, past a security post that waved them through without looking up. She asked after her grandmother first, and then Lauren and then Marcus in that order before she asked anything about herself. Evan told her that her grandmother had made him tea and asked whether he was one of her teachers, and Chloe laughed properly for the first time. Then she asked him why he had come. Evan had 11 months of prepared answers for that and did not use any of them. He said he had been wrong in the hospital and that he had known it at the time and had done it anyway. Chloe said that she knew, and that she had never held it against him, which was somehow harder to take than if she had. Then she asked what was in the books, and Evan realized he had been dreading this specific question for 2 days, because the answer involved telling a girl whose parents had been killed for asking it that she had been right about everything. He told her about the register, that the core does not make people stupid in general terms. It does it individually, one entry at a time, to every human being with a birth record, which means it is not a fog over the species. It is 8 billion separate decisions, maintained continuously, and somebody has been keeping the hardware alive to make sure they keep being made. Chloe listened to all of it without saying anything, and at the end asked the question Evan had been avoiding since the reading room. He asked whether it could be switched off. Evan said yes. He said it in the flat voice of somebody who has known the answer for 2 days and has not enjoyed carrying it. The register can be cleared. The specification describes how, because a system that assigns entries has to be able to release them, and Vance had documented the procedure in the same flat tone as everything else. It takes physical access, an authenticated instruction, and about 40 minutes. Chloe asked what happens to people afterwards. Evan said he did not know and that this was the entire problem. Nobody currently alive has ever had an unthrottled mind. Every institution, every profession, every relationship in this world is built around a baseline that would stop being true on a Tuesday afternoon. Air traffic control, power distribution, hospitals, 8 billion people waking up several times sharper than they went to sleep on the same afternoon with no warning and no preparation. Evan said he had run it forward about 6 different ways in the reading room, and that 4 of them were catastrophic within a week. Chloe asked what the other 2 looked like. He said the other 2 looked like the best thing that had ever happened to anybody, and that he could not tell them apart from the first 4 in advance. She was quiet for a while, and then said that her parents had died for a story about a government culling people to keep an average tidy, and that she was not especially moved by an argument about disruption. Evan said that was fair, and that it was also not an answer, and Chloe said she knew, and that she had not been offering one. They drove for a while without talking. Somewhere behind them, a warehouse full of spare parts sat in the dark, exactly as they had found it, dust and all. And Evan sat in the back of it, doing the only thing he had ever been genuinely good at, which was holding several things in his head at once and refusing to put any of them down. The invitation arrived 4 days later, on paper, at an address that did not exist. It named a hotel, a time, and nothing else. Carter's people found no record of anybody booking the room, which Carter said was itself the most informative thing about it. Professor Hale was sitting by the fireplace with a pot of tea and 2 cups already laid out. Evan stood in the doorway for slightly too long, and then came and sat down, because there was nothing else useful to do with the information. She apologized for the theater, said it was not her idea, and told him that she had been the custodian of that collection for 31 years and had been reporting on it for all of them. Evan asked whether the 2 men with the case had been hers. She said they had not been hers, that she had reported them the same afternoon, and that this was rather the point. She said the domain was not one organization with one opinion. It was 11 centuries of people who had inherited the same problem, and they did not agree about very much. The men who had taken Chloe were a faction. Hale's faction had spent 9 days trying to find her and had failed, because they were librarians and archivists rather than people who search container ports. Evan pointed out that Julian had also been theirs. She said Julian had been theirs and had been a catastrophe, and that she was not going to defend him. Then she said she had not come to explain the domain. She had come to answer the question he had actually been asking for a fortnight, which was why the core exists at all. 10,000 years ago, by this world's reckoning, human civilization was not stalled. That is the version in the schoolbooks, and it is a lie of the useful kind. It was moving extremely fast, faster, Hale said, than anything in the record before or since. And every time it had gone that fast, it had ended the same way. The 28 were not the first. They were the 4th. There had been 3 prior civilizations on this planet capable of building what they built, and there was no record of any of them, which is a fact about how thoroughly each one ended. They found the previous 3 the way you find anything that old, by digging. and they spent 40 years working out what had happened to them. The answer was not war, and it was not climate, and it was not disease. It was simpler than any of those and considerably harder to do anything about. A civilization of unthrottled minds reliably builds something it cannot control, inside roughly 2 centuries of reaching the capability, and it does not matter what the something is. Sometimes it is a machine. Twice it was chemistry. Hale said the 28 had cataloged 11 distinct mechanisms and had stopped cataloging because the mechanism was clearly not the variable. The variable was speed. Every one of them had arrived at the capability faster than it had arrived at the judgment, and the gap had killed them. So the 28 did the only thing anybody had ever thought of that addressed the actual variable. They slowed the species down. Not stopped, slowed. A throttle applied per person, sized so that civilization still moves and still arrives, but takes roughly 1,000 times longer to get anywhere. Which is why ancient Egypt sits nearly 2 million years back. The timeline in that history book is not a translation error. It is the actual record of what the throttle costs. Evan sat with that for a while, and then said the obvious thing, which was that it had worked. Hale agreed that it had worked. 10,000 years and counting, against a previous best of about 200. By the only measure the 28 cared about, it is the most successful thing any human being has ever built. Then Evan said the other obvious thing, which was that he had watched a hospital corridor fill up with people who nearly died because somebody sorted a spreadsheet wrong. That he had met a man who murdered his own family because somebody showed him a share price and told him it was a sign. That a woman had lost both parents to keep an average tidy. Hale did not argue with any of it. She said that everything he had just listed was true and was the price, and that the 28 had known the shape of it when they switched the thing on. She said the purge in that African country had not been sanctioned, that it had been a faction acting on an alarm about regional drift, and that it was the worst thing the domain had ever done. She also said that Chloe's parents had been killed by that same faction, and that Hale had spent 20 years failing to have it disbanded. Evan asked why she was telling him any of this. She said because he was the 5th, and there was a conversation the domain has with each of them, and she had drawn the short straw. 4 people in 11 centuries had walked into the collection and read the books, exactly as he had. Each of them worked out the register inside a month. Each of them worked out that it could be cleared. Each of them was found and told what Evan was being told now. And all 4 of them decided to leave it on. Evan asked what happened to them afterwards. Hale said 2 joined the domain and spent the rest of their lives maintaining the thing they had decided not to switch off. 1 refused to participate, was left entirely alone, and died old in a house in Portugal having never told anybody anything. And 1 changed his mind 11 years later, went for the register with a crew and a plan, and did not reach it. Evan noted that this was not really a description of 4 free choices. Hale said that was fair, and that she had made the same objection at 40 and had been told the same thing she was about to tell him, which is that the domain has never once been able to stop any of them and has never tried. It has no authority over an unregistered mind. It cannot find them reliably, and it cannot predict them at all. All it can do is sit down with them in a hotel and tell them everything and hope they are the sort of person who takes it seriously. Evan said that was an appalling way to run a species. Hale said she had been saying that for 31 years and had yet to be offered a better one. He took all of it back to the council and put it in front of the 2 people entitled to an opinion, and one of them had been in a partition board room 11 days earlier. Carter's position was straightforward, and he stated it once. The council existed to keep geniuses alive. It had no policy on the register, and he was not going to invent one in a basement. Chloe listened to the whole account of the previous 3 civilizations without interrupting, and then asked the question Evan had somehow failed to ask in the hotel. She asked how the 28 had known that the throttle was the fix, rather than the thing they happened to try that did not immediately kill anybody. Evan opened his mouth, and then did not say anything for about 4 seconds, which for him is a very long time. Because she was right. 3 data points, no controls, no repetition, and a conclusion that conveniently required them to be the only people left in charge. It is a defensible reading of the evidence. It is not the only one, and 10,000 years of it being enforced does not make it more correct, it only makes it harder to test. Chloe pointed out that 4 unregistered people had now examined the argument, and all 4 had accepted it, which was either strong confirmation or the single most obvious selection effect she had ever heard described. Evan said it was the second one. Every one of those four had been found by the domain and given the argument by somebody who already believed it, in a room the domain chose, before they had any way to check it independently, including him 4 days ago in a hotel. That did not make what Hale told him false. It made it unverified, which is a different problem and a much more annoying one. So Evan spent 9 days trying to check it, and this is the part he would later describe as the most frightening fortnight of his life, which is saying something for a man who had been shot at. The council pulled everything the 28 had left outside the collection. Excavation records, site surveys, the physical evidence for the 3 prior civilizations. The evidence was real. That was the first thing he established, and the one he had most wanted to be wrong about. 3 separate layers, 3 separate sudden terminations, at intervals that had nothing to do with anything geological. Something had been here 3 times and had stopped very quickly each time. What he could not establish, in 9 days or in any number of days, was why. The 28's causal argument was reconstruction. Careful, honest, extensively documented reconstruction, by people considerably cleverer than him, and still reconstruction. There is no experiment. There is no control group. There is one planet, and it has been run 4 times, and the 4th run is currently going considerably better than the first 3. Chloe asked him, at the end of the 9 days, what he actually believed. He said he believed the 28 were probably right about the danger and definitely wrong about the remedy, and that those 2 things were not in conflict. A species that outruns its own judgment is a real problem. Solving it by removing the judgment from everybody permanently is not a solution. It is a holding action that has been running for 10,000 years without anybody ever proposing what comes after it. In the entire collection, across 400 volumes, there is no document describing how the throttle is ever supposed to come off. Evan checked that 4 times, because a system with no exit condition is either a mistake or a decision, and he wanted to know which. It was a decision. Vance had written about it in a margin once and then never again. He wrote that they had argued about the exit condition for 2 years, and that in the end nobody could describe a state of the world in which it would be safe to lift it. And so they had left the question to whoever came after. 4 people had come after. Every one of them had looked at the size of the question, decided it was not theirs, and handed it on. Which is, Evan pointed out, exactly what he had done in a hospital room a year ago, when the question had been considerably smaller and had still been too big for him. Chloe asked whether that meant he had decided. He said it meant he had decided how to decide, which she said was the most irritating sentence he had ever produced. He said he was not going to clear 8 billion entries on the strength of an argument he could not test, and he was not going to spend the next 60 years guarding a machine because 4 frightened people in a hotel told him to. And then he told them what he was going to do instead. And Carter, who had spent 20 years in a job that mostly involved not reacting to things, sat down. What Evan proposed took him about 4 minutes to describe, and Carter about 3 days to stop objecting to. He was not going to clear the register. Not that year, and probably not in his lifetime, and he said so first because everything else depended on it. 8 billion people waking up sharper on a Tuesday afternoon, into institutions built for who they used to be, is not liberation. It is the largest single disruption in the history of the species, arriving with no notice. But he was not going to hand the question on either, because 4 people had already done that, and the result was a machine with no exit condition being maintained in secret by people who were frightened of it. So he was going to build the exit condition. Write down, in specific and falsifiable terms, what the world would have to look like before it was safe to lift the throttle. Not a mood, not a judgment. Conditions somebody could check. Carter pointed out that the 28 had spent 2 years failing to do exactly that. Evans said he knew, and that they had been trying to design it for a species they were about to make stupid. The problem is easier if you are allowed to change the world first. Redundant infrastructure. Institutions that do not fall over when their staff change. A way of teaching people faster than they currently learn. None of which requires touching the register at all, and all of which he could begin immediately. Because he had 200 million euros he had never spent, and half of a family holding company he had won at a board game. Chloe asked how long that would take. Evan said 40 years if it went well. She said that was an enormous amount of time to leave a hospital corridor, full of people waiting for somebody to sort a spreadsheet. Evan agreed that it was and did not pretend otherwise, and that was where the argument stopped being won, because neither of them had anything better. The council's position took 3 days and arrived as a single sentence. They would protect him while he worked, they would not help him build anything, and they would not stop him if he changed his mind. Which Evan noted was the most honest institutional position anybody had offered him in 2 years. There was one thing he wanted to do first, and it required going to the register in person. The addressing route is not in a data center, and it is not in orbit. It is under a mountain, at the end of 11 kilometers of rail tunnel that stopped being used for anything else about 9,000 years ago. Hale walked them in. The domain did not stop them, which Evan had expected and Carter had not, and which took some of the tension out of the first hour. There were no guards. There was no door with a lock on it. There was a tunnel, and at the end of it a chamber, and the reason nobody had ever taken it was that until 3 weeks ago nobody had been able to read the manual. The register hall is roughly the size of a cathedral, and it is entirely silent. Thousands of cabinets around a curved wall, each one carrying a single small steady light, and no sound at all except the ventilation. Chloe stood on the walkway for a long time looking at it, and eventually said that she had expected it to look evil, and that this was much worse. It looks like a well-maintained facility. Somebody has been replacing the failed units. The dust is off the walkway. There is a logbook by the console with entries in 4 different hands. Hale said the last entry was hers, from 19 months ago, and that she had swept the walkway herself because it seemed disrespectful not to. Evan spent 2 hours at the console before he touched anything, checking that the machine matched the specification he had read, because a document written 9,000 years ago is a claim rather than a fact. It matched, every subsystem in the place the drawing said, doing what the text said it did, which meant the clearing procedure was real and took physical access, an authenticated instruction, and about 40 minutes. And Evan sat in front of it with the ability to end the arrangement that had governed every human mind for 10,000 years, and did not do it. He had thought that would be the difficult part. It was not. He had already decided, and the decision did not get harder for being in the room with the machine. What was difficult was the other thing, which was smaller by every measure and considerably harder to justify. The register can be cleared 1 entry at a time. That is how it was designed, because a system that assigns entries individually has to be able to release them individually. Evan had worked out on the 9th day that he could do it, and had spent the 6 days since deciding whether he was allowed to. Because there is an argument, and it is a good one, that a man who has just declined to lift the throttle on 8 billion people has no business lifting it for anybody. Handing it out one at a time to people you happen to know is how every closed system in this world already works. It is exactly the thing Zachary's father did with a school place. Chloe had made that argument to him herself, twice, unprompted, which Evan noted was not the behavior of somebody angling for it. The counter-argument took him 6 days to be honest about, because it is less flattering, which is that he had spent 2 years as the only person in the world who could hold a thought all the way to the end of itself, and it had very nearly broken him. Not the danger, the loneliness of it, explaining everything twice, watching people agree with him because he was confident rather than because they had followed it, deciding, alone, in a concrete basement, what happens to a species. 4 people before him had faced that, and 2 of them had joined an organization rather than keep facing it by themselves. The 40-year plan requires somebody to check his work, not to agree with it, to check it properly all the way down and tell him when it is wrong. There is currently nobody alive who can do that, and the next unregistered person is due in approximately 1,300 years. So the honest framing is not generosity, and it is not favoritism. It is that a plan which depends entirely on one person being right is a bad plan, and he had written that criticism himself on day 4 about the 28. He put the argument to her in full, including the part where his motives were mixed, because she had spent 4 years building a corkboard and deserved better than a decision handed down. Chloe listened to all of it and then asked whether it would hurt. Evan said he did not know. The documentation described the process from the machine's side and said nothing whatsoever about what it is like from the inside, because the 28 had never done it to anybody. She said that was fine, and asked what happened if she stopped being able to live with what she then knew. Evan said the entry could be reinstated, that he had checked it 4 times, and that he would do it himself the day she asked. She said good, and then said she would not ask. Carter watched the whole exchange from the walkway and did not intervene, and Hale watched it with an expression Evan could not read at all. Afterwards, Hale said that the third of the four, the one who died old in Portugal, had wanted to do exactly this for somebody and had been talked out of it, and had written about regretting it for 40 years. The procedure itself is enormously undramatic. Evan typed an identifier, confirmed it twice, and the console asked him whether he was certain in the flattest language he had ever seen a machine use. Somewhere on the curved wall, one cabinet among several thousand did something invisible, and one small steady light went out. Chloe said that she did not feel anything at all, and sounded disappointed about it. Then, about 90 seconds later, she stopped talking mid-sentence and sat down on the edge of the platform. She sat there for 11 minutes without saying anything, and Evan, who had a great many questions, had the sense to leave her alone for all of them. When she did speak, she asked him a question about the register architecture that he had not thought of and could not immediately answer. Evan stood in a 9,000-year-old facility under a mountain and discovered that being outthought by somebody, even briefly, was the best thing that had happened to him in 2 years. The second thing she said was that his 40-year plan had a hole in it around year 12, and she was right about that too. Hale asked on the walk back out whether he intended to do that again. Evan said not soon, and not without a rule for it, and not by himself. He said the rule was the part he was going to spend the next year on, because the difference between him and the school board director was currently a matter of taste rather than principle, and he was aware of it. He went back to Harvard in the spring, because the identity was useful, and because he had, to his own surprise, become slightly attached to it. He kept getting one question in 4 deliberately wrong, which was now considerably harder to justify, and which he did anyway. The Sterling holdings were restructured into something with a very boring name that spent money on redundant infrastructure and teaching methods, and which will not produce a visible result for about 15 years. Carter's people watch it. Hale's faction knows about it and has decided, for now, that it is preferable to the alternative. Chloe enrolled that spring, on a place she got herself, having sat the entrance examination and finished it in 19 minutes. She did not deliberately get anything wrong, on the grounds that she had spent 4 years being underestimated and had no intention of arranging any more of it, which caused a certain amount of institutional excitement that Evan watched from 3 rows back with an expression Carter later described as insufferable. There are now 2 unregistered minds on this planet, which is one more than there has been at any point in 10,000 years, and the domain has not yet decided how it feels about that. Somewhere under a mountain, several thousand small lights are still on. The conditions list has 9 items and 2 of them are provisionally satisfied. The exit condition exists now, written down in specific terms where somebody can find it. That is not the same as fixing anything. It is the first time in 10,000 years that the question has had an answer written next to it. Handoyan failed the civil service exam 3 times, and then a boy called Silas got expelled for 1 punch, and then a first-year called Evan started a 40-year project he will probably not live to finish, none of which is a power fantasy. But he is no longer the only person awake in the house, and for the moment that is enough to be going on with.